All right, I think we are now live. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Francesca Dubrock, and I'm the Chief Curator at the Anchorage Museum. I'm just going to get us started with a little land acknowledgement, and then I'll introduce our artist today. So right now I'm located here in Anchorage on the ancestral and present day homelands of the Eklutna Dena'ina. Wherever you may be joining from today, I hope that you will take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of your area, as well as their care and ongoing stewardship of the land. I'm super delighted to introduce our artist this afternoon, Kimberly Fulton Orozco, who is joining us from all the way over on the East Coast. Kimberly is a multidisciplinary investigator and producer of storytelling projects. She works as a freelance artist, photography producer, and writer in Atlanta, Georgia. She holds a BFA in drawing, painting, and printmaking from Georgia State University and is a student of museum studies at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Her practice is informed by her relationship to her multicultural heritage and relationship to assimilation. She grew up in California's Mojave Desert. Kimberly's work is rooted in connection to the stories of her ancestors, the Kaigani Haida of Southeast Alaska. She has studied Northwest Coast art theory under Jackson Paulus and Northwest Coast design under David R. Boxley, Steve Brown, and Robert K. Mills by way of Sea-Alaska Heritage Institute and the University of Alaska Southeast. She recently worked as the primary researcher and producer for a photo essay, Inspiring Awe in Alaska, for Smithsonian Magazine. And today, Kimberly is going to be sharing a bit about her work and practice. She's got some slides prepared, and then we're going to basically just have a pretty informal discussion about her process of reconnecting to her cultural heritage through her work. We always intend these sessions to be approachable and kind of informal opportunities for people to ask questions and get to know an artist better. So I really encourage anyone tuning in right now to type questions for Kimberly in the chat, and we'll make sure that we get to those in the second half of the program. And I just want to finally acknowledge that we are grateful for the generous support of Art Bridges in making this virtual artist in residence program possible. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kimberly to share some of her work with us. Thanks.
Thank you, Francesca, and hello. I am Kimberly Fulton Orozco, and I am currently in Atlanta, Georgia, which is on the ancestral homes of Muskogee people. And I have a slideshow that I am going to share my screen. Okay. And thank you for that wonderful introduction, Francesca.
You're very welcome. Oops, I wasn't muted before. Now I'll mute.
It's taking just a second. Oh.
For those watching, I will be dropping some links in the chat here for Kimberly's website and an article that we have on the museum blog.
Okay, so Sandlanai is my Haida name, and I have not officially received it yet, but I will receive this name, and my family will also receive names at an adoption ceremony on June 4th, which we're all very excited about. And yeah, so where to begin? I'm going to begin with this mask because this mask was kind of the mark of me understanding that my connection to art is somehow always braided in with my connection to my Haida ancestry. And this sort of marked a trajectory that was firmly, it sort of marked the beginning of the path of me making the body of work that comes after this. And this one's called The Wounded Daughter of Foam Woman. And she is made of plaster bandages, rooster feathers, and abalone shell. And there's just a detail shot. And then this is a form line experiment. It's a bandana design that I made. And it's called Kuganjad, Kudangjad. And so this oh, I don't even know how to go back here. Okay, great. So Kuganjad will come up a lot in my work. She is a mythical figure that is really interesting to me because she is something of the conscience in Haida mythology, and she tends to pop up in stories when people get themselves into trouble and are looking for a way out. And so she's got this very cunning benevolence. This one, The Wounds of Five Generations, is sort of a timeline, and the black is the beginning of the timeline. It reads from left to right, and it represents my great-great-grandfather, Frank Nix, who was born in Haucan on Prince of Wales Island, and his daughter, who's represented in the next rectangle, is my great-grandmother, my Nana Nettie, who was born in Heidelberg, and I think she was the first baby in her family to be born in Heidelberg, and spent a lot of her childhood at the Sheldon Jackson School, and then followed by my grandmother, my father, and me. And the significance of the passage of time is, you know, in the boarding schools, they were conditioned to assimilate to the settler colonial culture and to the quote unquote civilized people who had moved in and changed their life ways. And I think in a lot of ways, the process of assimilation is made to seem like it's somewhat natural, and that it's just sort of the evolution of how we're meant to adapt to society, but it's actually like very, very cruel and strips people of their culture. And culture is the way that over thousands of years we have come to deal with the brutality of life and just being human and the hardships. So ceremony, art, expression, all of these things are really necessary functions of coping with the world, and to take those things away is to take away people's coping mechanisms. And so yeah, I think that's what I was representing in this piece. And here,
sorry, can I interject? There's a question from the chat. Someone wanting to know what your Haida name means.
Sandlanai, it means first light or beautiful sunrise. And the meaning that was shared with me from the person who's giving it to me is that It represents the time before the raven brought light to the world. And so basically that first sunrise.
That's beautiful. Thanks. Oh,
Um,
and then another person, then I'll let you get on with your presentation, is asking about why you're being adopted.
well, Haida culture is matrilineal, and I inherited my Haida ancestry from my father. So in Haida culture, I don't have a clan. So the protocol when you were born, when you inherit your Haida heritage from your father, the protocol is that you are adopted by a clan of the opposite moiety. So um, in Haida culture, you are either a raven or an eagle. And since my father is an eagle, um, my siblings and I are being adopted into a raven clan.
Thanks for sharing that. That is super interesting.
Yeah. um, okay. This piece, and thank you for interrupting. Please feel free to interrupt with any questions. That's super fun. This piece is Kugan Jad Emerges. And here I bent the rules of form line quite a bit. Usually you don't see it layered like this. So it's not, I don't think it's traditional form line by any stretch, but typically in form line designs, Kugan Jad is a secondary image. She usually doesn't appear as like the center of a piece. And in this, I put her at the center because I feel like she's such an important, the concepts around her existence are so important, of consciousness, conscience, and guidance, and listening to your inner voice. So this piece is like really big actually, and it has since been hung on a red cedar sort of a Chilkat loom top that was made. I sewed it onto there, and I just realized that I don't think I have an image of that, and I should do that before I send it away. And here's a detail image of that.
For those that are curious about the sewing onto the loom Kimberly's talking about, there is a post on the Anchorage Museum Instagram where you can see a little bit of that process if you're curious to go check it out.
And then this one is called Split You, Twisted and Split Again. And I made this one actually before I made the other one. And kind of saw Kugan Jad in the middle there. And this one inspired the one before. But I really liked the way that the layers are, the way that there's so much possibility to use the very like finite shapes of form line in so many ways. It's just infinite possibilities. So yeah, this one's a little bit playful. And also this one's acrylic on paper, so this is all painted. And then this one is a monotype that is painted on top of the print. And I like to play with texture when I'm screen printing, because screen printing is usually so flat. But I like to like put screen filler and then wash it out in different places and just play with the different chemicals that are available to remove and draw and mask and fill. And this piece ended up, when I was painting it, it reminded me of a sun coming out of the water, and it was made right around the time that the bodies of the children under the residential schools in unmarked graves were being discovered. And it felt like for the first time the spirits of all of these children who had quote unquote disappeared were able to be set free. And I wanted to honor the memory of those children and also express gratitude for my own life, because events like that make you realize how easily I could have just not been here at all. This one is also a monotype and printed with a silk screen, and I printed several layers. This one was with stencils, where the other one was with screen fillers. So I did this one with a bunch of stencils and then painted it. And in the process of making pieces, I find a lot of times that I'm drawn to certain phrases that maybe have come from things that I've been reading or events that have happened in the world around the same time, or stories that I remember. But there's usually like some sort of phrase or something that is sticking with me as the pieces are, as I'm actually like moving through the pieces physically. And this one, I'm not going to say it in Haida because because I don't want to say it very badly. But the words mean to push and to pull. And I follow the song of the killer whale is the phrase that stuck with me. And the killer whale in Northwest Coast mythology and also Haida mythology is appears, and it's like your ancestors who have passed visiting, and they're also known to lead people home. And I feel like that's kind of how the exploration of Haida culture through art is for me. Like there's some sort of coming home-ness to it.
Kim, I'm going to interject with a question here. We have someone that's asking if you could explain a little bit more about formline, and as you're talking about these works that are monotypes with silk screen and painted layers, I also wanted to add a question just regarding the way you use repetition and abstraction and sort of layering to talk about shifts in identity and cultural understanding. And if you could maybe speak to that, to your use of formline and sort of all these layers and sort of how that's an expression of your own journey within your culture.
Yeah. Okay. So the first part of the question about formline. Formline is the traditional design style, and I believe that formline is a term that was coined by Bill Holm, who was an avid student of Northwest Coast arts, and formline, the way that I'm speaking of it, is really talking about the design styles of the Haida, the Tlingit, and the Tsimshian designs from most, I guess it, and I could be wrong about the beginning date, but most of the objects that this refers to were collected from the mid 1800s to the early 1900s. And so all of the objects basically contain this design style that is governed by a set of principles that goes across like thousands and thousands of objects. And so it's the ovoid, the Steve Brown, who was at the Burke Museum forever and ever, and is an expert on Northwest Coast design, calls the ovoid, which is, let's see if I have, oh no, my slideshow will not let me go backwards. Let's see if I have a good ovoid to share. That's a bad one, but like this shape in the corners, the black shape in the corners is an ovoid, and Steve Brown calls that the mother of design, which I really like that term because most of the Northwest Coast formline designs that I'm talking about sort of emanate from the ovoid in a design. And then the second part of your question about how I'm using layering and abstraction with formline as an expression of my personal relationship with culture. I think that there's like a way that typically Northwest Coast formline artists approach making designs. And I think because of the way I kind of have learned about it, I don't do it that way. And I think, so I guess I use, I sort of tried at first to arrive, before I was able to like formally take any classes about formline or Northwest Coast design, I would attempt to arrive at these different design elements in whatever way I could. And so a lot of times that was like cutting and piecing things together, not really knowing how the design system worked. And as I've learned more about it, I think that I layer things in order to incorporate more of like my actual atmosphere into my work. So like here, for instance, the U shape is there, but it's like not a pretty formline U shape. It just looks like, it looks like something else. But I've done that. I think there's a part of me like that doesn't feel like I have a right to be formal in my execution of the artwork. Like I don't have a right to do traditional work. And I think that just stems from having a series of like ancestors, I want to say that, but it's like weird to call my grandmother my ancestor, who were very divorced from the culture, who worked very hard to assimilate, and not in any direct way made me feel like I wasn't a Haida, but just through really kind of denying or not being very like proud to share that part of her. Um, there's this residual, well, am I sort of question in my head sometimes. And that actually is a nice transition into this piece, which is a collage of block prints. And the block print was a portrait of me with the words "not you" beneath it. And the "not you" came from a story that my great aunt Jean told me about being 6 years old and walking um, walking into the woods with her china and her uncles to go find a tree to make a canoe. And um, so she told me this story, and I haven't talked to any other family member who had ever heard this story. So I'm really glad that recorded I recorded her recounting this story from when she was a little girl, and she was almost 90 when she told me this story. But she said that they were walking in the woods and they got to this enormous tree, and Chana and her uncles put their hand on the tree, and Chana started talking to the tree. And she said that she put her hand on the tree, and he looked down at her and said something in Haida to her that she understood as "not you." And she's like she was a really feisty person. And so she put her hand on the tree anyway. And she said when they were walking later, she asked him why he said that to her. And he said, because this is not going to be your life. And she was the oldest of her siblings, and there were a total of 13 of them. And their mother had been in the Sheldon Jackson School for a lot of years of her childhood. And there was just something so like dark and heavy about what he was actually saying to her. Because for the rest of her life, not because he said that to her, but for the rest of her life, her Haida identity was not really a celebrated part of who she was. And so in this piece, I guess I'm trying to integrate that story back into an expression of who I am today. And it's a lot of collage on paper and paint. And this is another monoprint with silkscreen and acrylic wash and paint. And this is also a monotype, but this one, I really enjoyed the process of this one. And there's only one of these, and I really just layered and layered stencils and painted directly onto the screen with watercolor, and just kept printing layers. There are probably 10 or 12 layers of watercolor and translucent inks and transparent inks on a very, very thin mulberry paper. And yeah, it made me think of, there was, I cannot remember his name right now, but I will remember his name at some point, probably right after I get off of this. But there, the octopus just has this really beautiful significance in Northwest Coast cultures, and the way that it can shape shift and fit through these tiny spaces, the way that it can camouflage and is just, its body is so intelligent, that it made me think of all the ways that people have hidden culture in their stories and like tucked it away and carried it through the generations, and that now it's able to be what it is, like waking up from a dream, or looking at a memory, or looking at something through the water. And this one's called Son of a Bear. And this is kind of an homage to my great-great-grandfather, who was one of his crests was the brown bear. And this is another process-oriented piece where I layer a lot, and I wove some cedar bark and a flicker feather onto this drawing.
Kim, we have a question. I believe it's a term you used in your story about your great aunt Jean, but someone's asking, what is Chenna?
Oh, Chana.
Chenna.
Sorry. That means grandfather in the Haida language. There are a few different pronunciations of it depending on which region you're from, but on my grandmother and her sister always said Chana.
Thanks for
So
that.
Chana and Nana were their grandparents.
And maybe this is a question you can address as you're talking about some of these pieces coming up. But we have someone asking, do you start with the shapes or colors first? And what is your process?
Oh, well, I guess the shapes are pretty, there are really just a few that I work with. So I typically, sometimes I'll use templates and just like lay out a design or a composition on like either on a black piece of paper or on the actual substrate that I'm using. And usually the colors are sort of an evolution. I'll start with one or two colors and then keep adding from there. I was going to say adding and subtracting, but I almost never subtract. So I think but the forms also over time will really change and morph, and I'll talk about that in another one. But this one, for instance, I cut out cardboard templates and moved them around on a surface before I came up with this composition. I wanted to make something that read like something jumping out of the water and also a vase of flowers at the same time. And yeah, this one started with the red, orange, the cyan, the lavender color, and then I just kept on going. And I put this one in there because it relates to this process. And this one I made for my son's class auction, and this was all made of paintings that the third grade class did. And I laid out this wonderful, very, very limited palette for them to work with. And then one of the first questions, as soon as they had all the paints in front of them and the paintbrushes, was like, do you have green? Do you have gray? And so I realized that I wasn't gonna end up with the colors that I thought I was. And yeah, so I really enjoyed this process of cutting things out and creating a composition based on just what was there. And so I want to try it with the forms that I usually work with. Um, and a little bit later, I'll show you guys how that's starting. And then this painting is a good example of the shifts and the changes that happen. So this actually started out with a lot of, like, with a big figurative face of a white raven. And you can kind of see it through the top left corner. I'm trying to point to it. Through the top left corner, you can see the eye of the bird. And yeah, I think I like just made marks until it was completely out of control and made absolutely no aesthetic sense whatsoever, and not on purpose. I just had a compulsion to continue to make marks. And but eventually, I mean, I knew that the form line, the cobalt blue, I knew that needed to be there, because I was actually starting to make the design for the regalia that we will wear for our adoption ceremony. And eventually kind of just covered over things until this was what was left. And the colors for this one were based on wolf moss and water and salmon eggs and coppers and cedar bark and cedar needles, and just a lot of the things that you would find while walking through the woods in Southeast Alaska. And there's a detailed shot of it with a lot of glare. Oh, I didn't title this piece. And I have this piece in my studio right now, and this is Hagas, which is my great grandmother's Haida name. And there are several interpretations of what that word means, but what the information that I got from my grandparents is that her name meant to be wild. And so I made this mask of her that kind of resembles and is inspired by the wild woman of the woods story, who was this big scary character who would come and steal children, eat children, take them out to the woods, and they would never come back. And I my dad actually made her copper eyes, and I wanted to have those there as sort of a redemption for her. And I put the cedar in her mouth. Usually you see the wild woman of the woods and her mouth is like open and like screaming with these scary teeth, or she's like howling or blowing, or like usually her mouth is open. And I made her smiling with her mouth full of cedar bark, as a way I wanted her to be scary no more. And because I feel like just who she was and how she lives and the memories of several of her children, at least, was maybe not as the kindest person. And by sharing her story and like reconsidering what it must have been like to have your entire worldview changed as a child, like from 0 to 8 years old, she was introduced to the world in a completely different way than the rest of her life went. And to be told that everything that she had grown to know and love about the world as a young girl was wrong and was a sure path to hell was maybe more than a child's psyche can bear. Maybe there's some compassion and forgiveness to be had for a child for that child who grows into an adult and becomes whatever they become. And then this is a more traditional design, not completely traditional. There are some things about it that aren't the way things ought to be done by maybe very strict traditionalists. But this is a drum design that I'm hoping I can finish painting in the next week. And this is about the keeping of our endangered language and the passage of a worldview through language. The artist and language learner, culture bearer, David R. Boxley, said to me one time that language is, and this isn't an exact quote, but language is like a picture book, a picture dictionary, a way of seeing the world. And he was describing to me how the Tsimshian language, Smalgiak, I think I said that right, is orients the person so differently in the world than the English language that it's almost like there are like two different types of beings. And I couldn't describe how exactly that is, except to say that in the Tsimshian language, and this is also similar in the Haida language, that you're always, whenever you're talking about your experience, you're orienting yourself to some natural feature of the world around you. So it's like the person in a place rather than the person existing as this like individual like cell on top of the world. So this was created specifically for an elder, a Haida elder, who is a language learner, language keeper, and the blue sort of represents the voice box and the voice and the passage and where it lives and that sort of cycle. And now the work that inspires me that's made by other people. Should I go straight into this, or is there a need to stop?
Well, we did have one question I didn't get to in the chat. And because you told so many stories about your grandmothers and great aunt, I wanted to follow up with a question that we had kind of discussed earlier, because I know that you've made recordings of elders in your family. And in addition to your Haida side of the family, you have a Mexican side of the family. And you mentioned that your maternal grandmother spoke only Spanish, and that one of your life goals was to become fluent in Spanish so that you could understand her stories in more detail. So I wonder if you could just share a little bit about the value of elders' stories, and what your process has been for learning and preserving this knowledge.
That's a great question, and something that I think about a lot. Yeah, my great grandmother lived for a very, very long time. she she passed away in, well, she was born in 1905 and she passed away in 2013. So she was almost 108 when she passed away, and she only spoke Spanish. And she lived in Chula Vista, California for at least from the time that I was a child. And I guess before that, she lived in downtown San Diego. And she had a great sense of humor. And also, I was disappointed when I realized that I would never be able to understand a joke that she told. So it was very important to me to learn to speak Spanish and understand enough to be able to sit down and talk with her. And I was able to sit down and talk with her, and I didn't record any of her stories. But luckily, my mom and her sisters and their aunts all have, there are a lot of them, and they all have really great stories. And I should actually probably think about recording some of their stories, because the world has changed so very much in the last 50 years, the last 100 years, that there are all these stories that are just disappearing. And you don't realize until someone passes away that you don't have the opportunity to ever ask them about their memories again. And things come up, and I am trying my best to not take for granted that the stories that my mom has, the stories that my dad has, the stories that our elders before them, I mean, in my, like, the generation above my parents now is, I mean, my grandfather's still left, but they're largely have passed away. But those memories are connected to they're a thread that lead back in time, and back to how things were done before. And while we do still continuously develop new ways of doing things, maybe better ways of doing things, there are a lot of ways of being that, if we don't preserve them, they just quietly disappear in time. So like my mom's mother, she showed love through food, and she was an amazing cook, and she didn't do it for big groups very often, but the meals that she made were just so deliciously memorable that her recipes were like the most important, or not the most important, but like they were very valuable heirlooms to our family. And so our cousins, and she showed me how to make her mole, and my cousins also just made sure to get some of those to keep with them. And so there are things like that, like the way that mole was made by your grandmother is not the same way that it's made on food.com or allrecipes.com. And you're never going to be able to get that recipe if you don't get it from the person who actually made it. Because if you're my age or older, I doubt your grandmother got her recipe off of the internet. And it might have come from their mother before them, or even farther back. And you just never know what little nuggets of wisdom are hidden inside of the ways of doing things. Like my grandmother always put a little piece of banana and apple at the beginning of making the mole, and she said that if you did that I mean, it's like she said that if you did this, that you wouldn't that the mole wouldn't upset your stomach. And I know that it works, and I don't know why, and I'm sure there's like a chemical explanation for it, and I'm sure like some people think that's crazy. I don't know.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. We have another question, and maybe it links into some of the work you wanted to share by other artists. And this person is asking, has your culture always been a core component of your work as an artist? If it hasn't, could you lend a few words on the juxtaposition of your experience working without and then afterwards working through your culture and what that has meant to you personally?
Yeah, great. So no, it hasn't always been a part of my art making, but when, it's always been a part of the art making that's really meant a lot to me. And it's always been a way of trying to, well, let me say this, that I have like paintings paintings and like block prints from 20 years ago where I am trying to create these Haida designs that I look back at and I remember really clearly making them, and I'm like, wow, there's like, this is related to the things that I make now. At that time, I wasn't thinking that I was going to become an artist. I was just making things because because I like to try stuff. But I think that there's work that I make that is just a part of who I am, and it's like creating an object or an image that is alive on its own and has its own spirit. There's like this there's this different sort of for lack of a better way of expressing it, there's this different sort of prayer that happens between the being and the object that comes out when I make pieces that are related to my connection with culture. And I can't really explain that in a way that is logical. Maybe it's just a sort of intuitive feeling. It's sort of like I don't know, there's something maybe very mystical about that process. And then I create things that are to like actually explore technique and hone technical skills that I'm trying to like teach my body how to do. And I guess the work that I really end up feeling is like the work, or like the finished pieces are the ones that marry those two processes. So like the intuition and the actual thinking brain. But the artist Craig Drennan said to me in a critique at school one time that the body is more intelligent than we sometimes allow it to be. And sometimes our best work comes out when we are just trusting the body to do what it needs to do. Did that answer the question?
I hope so. They'll chime in if it didn't. I think it was a great answer. I wanted to just let you know that we're at about 5 minutes to the hour. So,
Whoa.
so maybe choosing a couple of works here that are meaningful to you. We did have a question earlier in the chat about chilkat weaving specifically. And if you could speak a little bit about the significance of chilkat weaving. So I don't know if there's a work in your images of inspirations that might apply to that, but just throwing it out there if you have time to get to it.
Okay. Yeah, and if I don't answer that question, I would say that there are some wonderful, wonderful artists to go follow on Instagram if you're interested in chilkat weaving. I would definitely follow Lily Hope and her sister Ursula Hudson. They are both weavers that come from a line of weavers who know a lot about it and could tell you much more than I could. And I think that I don't have a chilkat piece in my
That's okay. I'll
okay.
drop links for Lily and Ursula's Instagram in the chat, so the person who asked that question can take a look.
Cool. So I'm going to talk really quickly through these. This one on the left is a piece created by Nicholas Galanin, and I thought I had the name of it, but the significance of this piece is that there's a dial on this bentwood box, which is a very traditional work of Northwest Coast art. In his case, he's a Tlingit and Umangan artist, and the dial is actually counts backwards from the number 1, and it speaks to the erasure of people through the use of blood quantum rules. And I found this piece really inspiring because I think that it encourages people who are part Native to connect with their culture in a meaningful way. And I think that that's very important to the perpetuation of the culture. And then on the right is a house pole that was carved by Squayants and Gidwan, TJ and Joe Young in Heidelberg. And the reason I chose this piece is because I think that the work that these brothers are doing is exceptional in the way that it allows a whole generation of, well, many generations, however many generations come after them, it allows them to see themselves in relationship to these monumental artworks in a way that they get to interact with it. And I think that in a way that's radical, because if you've ever been to Heidelberg, it's a very small town, and it's a place that you only go to if you're going there to go there. It's not like you stop in there on the way somewhere else. And it is also a place that was largely, I mean, it's a village that was created it's a village that was created right after all of the traditional villages were abandoned. And so it was built with Western style houses, and so that the Haida people could live on the island in a Western way. And so to infuse this town with these works of art is, and to be doing it right there in front of them is not a brand new thing, but I think that it's radically beautiful to involve the community in these projects and infuse the town with the energy and masterful artwork that is there. And then there are these pieces, really beautiful design by Greg Frisbee, who is an artist in Heidelberg. Amazing formline artist, just so elegant and almost effortless. And I put next to it a very old piece out of the Transforming Image, because to show the similarities and just how elegant and related they are to one another. And then Jackson Paulus and Donald Varnell. I saw this piece on the right, or in the left-hand picture, the piece on the right is the piece by Jackson Paulus. And I remember seeing this in like 2005 at the Burke Museum, and just, it blew my mind. It blew my mind like a piece of artwork maybe never has ever, like even to this day, just to see the relevance of tradition in this very abstracted way was really jolting and inspiring to me. And I think that the abstraction with the same materials and recognizable shapes that is also there in the right hand piece by Donald Varnell is pretty cool. And then of course, Masks by Bo Dick and a halibut hook. And this piece I felt like was really important, and I know that we're getting really close to the end, but I did just want to say that this piece I pulled because it just shows how much an object can, like how much an object can be. It was a halibut hook, and like the braided rope and the carved end of it are just done with such care and time. And I just love that the object was treated as so much more than just a thing. And then I'm just going to go through these and leave it there.
That's wonderful. It's powerful to see these works by artists, new and old, who have inspired your work. I don't know if we have any final comments or thoughts from the audience in the chat, but just for my part, it's been really wonderful to learn more about your work. And there was a comment earlier on from someone expressing how much they enjoy your titling. And I wanted to echo that. There's so much poetry in the titles that you choose for your works, and each one is so dense and layered with meaning and symbolism. So it's really lovely to have you walk us through those, and just appreciate your time and all that you've shared with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to anybody who might still be watching and everybody who did watch.
Yeah, there's links for those tuning in late in the chat that have Kimberly's website and an article about her on our blog, and also links for Lily and Ursula Hudson if you want to check out their work, or Lily Hope and Ursula Hudson. And yeah, hope you join us next month for our next artist, that will be Golga Oscar from Western Alaska. So thank you so much, Kimberly. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.